I first got introduced to the Decade program about a year ago, and I'll come out and say I'm actually a big fan of this program. No one really taught me about course management, and certainly not in a way that was very logical and data driven. Decade does exactly that. It made me rethink basically how I approach strategy on a golf course. Now, the common complaint about Decade is it's too conservative. The targets they pick frankly are just not aggressive enough, and tour players feel like they can hit their shots much closer than Decade gives them credit for. Now, Scott Fawcett will essentially argue that the law of averages come into play here, right? Yes, you may ultimately have some shots land closer to the hole, but that's not going to be enough to offset the amount of shots that you're going to miss off the green. So let's put that to the test, right? I think this is actually a math problem, and it can be solved. And the nice thing is we've got a great tool to do it. We've got a great tool to do it in Noonan. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at a particular situation here. I've got a tucked left pin. That pin is 5 yards from the edge of the green. Now, most players would probably just go ahead and take dead aim, not really thinking twice about it. Well, Decade forces you to start to rethink, do you aim at the pin, or because it is so close to the edge, should you be more conservative with your target? Now, each essentially, landing area that that ball can go into, we've assigned a strokes gained number to it. Now, this is where I'm going to make one little caveat, right? Just given the simplicity of the math, what I've done is I've actually bundled, these different distance tiers into one. So I'm saying under 20 feet, I've got an average strokes gained of 0.294. Now, essentially, I've taken the strokes gain number from 3 feet, 4 feet, 8 feet, kind of put that all together into an average and bundle them that way. Did the same thing between 20 and 40 feet. Now, the nice thing about landing in the rough, essentially all my shots in the rough are going to be within about a 40 foot. So we're going to lose about a half shot for the shots that landed in the rough. And the bunkers also going to lose a little bit more than a half shot, which again are all going to be about 30 feet away from the hole. Now, what Decade will say is Decade essentially creates a system and a metric that we need to use in order to help us pick our targets. So, from each distance you are away from the flag, it's going to give you a baseline number. And that number represents how close to the edge of the green you can actually aim your target. So, from 150 yards away, the closest I can aim my target is 8 yards away from the edge of the green. So I cannot, based off of this, go at the flag, which is only 5 yards away. Now, if there are obstacles in the way, such as a bunker, then we need to apply a modifier. So I need to increase that buffer by 1 more yard. So my Decade target is 9 yards away from the edge of the green. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to compare three different scenarios, and we're going to look at the total strokes gained to see which target is best. Do I aim directly at the flag? Do I use the Decade target? Or do I aim very conservative right at the middle of the green? Here's what the data says. So just to give you a visual representation, I've got a Decade target. It's 9 yards away from the edge of the green. Obviously, I got my flag, which is 5 yards, and then the middle of the green, which is going to be a little bit further to the right. Here's what the math says about aiming directly at the flag. Now, the thing you have to understand first about this is the way that Noonan works. So Noonan creates a statistical representation of your dispersion pattern. We essentially look at the variance in your miss, both in carry and offline, and will show you essentially the model of and predict where your next shot will land. So what this is saying is 95% of my shots will land somewhere in that red circle. That essentially represents two standard deviations. 68% of my shots will land within that blue circle. That's one standard deviation. And then when we overlay the GPS information of the golf course, we can actually calculate the odds. Your next shot will land in each area of the hole. So a 74% chance to hit the green, a 6% chance to hit the bunker, a 21% chance to hit the rough. Now, when I apply those numbers, those percentages to each strokes gained, I get a total strokes gained number for each category. So let's look at the shots that land within 20 feet. Effectively, that's pretty much perfectly representative of that blue circle. So 68% of my shots are going to land within that blue circle. Essentially, that's all basically a 20-foot radius. So 68% of my shots will land within the blue circle. That's all within 20 feet. We apply that average strokes gained number of 0.294 to it. So I get a total strokes gained for that category of shots to 0.19992. I'm going to do the same thing with the remainder of the shots that land on the green. So there's 74% of my total shots will land on the green. We know 68% of them will be within 20 feet. So 6% of those will be between 20 and 40 feet. That has an average strokes gained number of, I'm actually going to lose 0.091 strokes, which gives me a total strokes gained of negative 0.00546. Now we're going to do this same thing with the shots that land in the rough. 21% of my shots will land in the rough, and then 6% of my shots will land in the bunker. We multiply that by the strokes gained figure for bunker shots, and we get a total strokes gained for aiming directly at the pin of 0.06057. How does that compare to the decade target? All right, so we've moved our decade target over to the right. What that has done is essentially increase the distance that most of my putts are going to land. So I have seen essentially a decrease in the number of putts that are going to be within that 20-foot radius. So only about 34% of my putts will land within 20 feet, bringing my total strokes gained for that category to 0.09996. We have seen obviously an increase in the amount of putts that are going to be between 20 and 40 feet. And we have also seen a decrease in the amount of shots that land in the rough and the bunker. So the total strokes gained for the decade target, I'm actually going to lose 0.00406 strokes by taking the decade target. Now you remember, the strokes gained for aiming at the pin was positive. So the decade target is actually worse. What this is saying is the strokes the strokes that I have gained through reducing my odds to hit it into the rough and the bunker is actually less than the strokes that I lose by increasing the distance that my putts are going to start from. It's kind of an interesting insight. As you can probably guess, we're going to see more of the same when we aim at the target. So even getting even more conservative, and we have now introduced a new category of 50 to 60 feet, we're going to get a total strokes gained for being even more conservative of negative 0.0735 for aiming at the center of the green. So again, we have actually lost strokes, even though we have decreased the amount of shots that are going to potentially land in the rough and the bunker. So just to kind of summarize the results here, right? An average PGA Tour pro would actually lose 0.0646 strokes by using the decade target versus aiming directly at the flag. Now, in context, right, again, that number doesn't seem overly large, but if you were to apply that to every single approach shot hit during a PGA Tour event, the player would actually lose a total of 3.62 strokes during the entire tournament. And that assumes 14 approach shots per round. Now, obviously, it's a big assumption, but I think it's helpful to kind of contextualize what that strokes gain or loss metric actually means in a context of a larger tournament. So this result actually proves in certain situations, obviously not all of them, that the decade target and the modifications perhaps are slightly too conservative. Now, this is not an indictment on the decade program. We are dealing with fractions here, and obviously being able to pick a 4-yard target versus a 9-yard target from 150 yards there's going to be some room for error there, and perhaps we account for that. But statistically speaking, in this situation, it is actually better to aim at the flag than using a decade target.